the real truth behind the USDA and our canning regulations and or recommendations. So we have in the United States pretty specific guidelines for what is considered safe canning. When to use a pressure canner for non-acidic foods like your vegetables, your meats, your combination recipes, versus doing a water bath or even open kettle canning where you've got your fruits and those acidic type foods where you process them either in a steam canner, a water bath canner, or some people will even still do open kettle canning where you're not actually processing it in anything, it's just putting the hot contents in the jar and then having a vacuum action that ends up sealing it. So within all of this, there's a lot of people who will argue and say that the USDA has all of these safety recommendations for using a pressure canner on foods and different tested recipes, etc., just as a means to keep people from putting up food or making it harder to put up food, and they don't think that you should abide by said safety rules. The argument that your great-grandparents or people have been canning for a really long time and pressure canners and pressure cookers are a recent invention and people preserved food for many, many years without them, and so there's no need to use them now. Now, I will go on record as saying that generally I am not very trustful of a lot of the government agencies that we have, the way that they operate right now with all of the lobbyists that are able to funnel large amounts of money in and can easily sway different decisions and even different studies that are done because you have to look at who's backing them, etc. However, we really need to look at the history of canning food and the USDA recommendations, studies, and how did all of these develop specifically in the United States? Because obviously I live in the US and those are the guidelines that I use when I look at my food safety. So as far as pressure canners and pressure cookers being a recent invention, that's actually completely false. The pressure cooker was first invented in 1679, 1679. So hundreds and hundreds of years ago was actually when pressure cooking food was first invented. And of course, those pressure cookers didn't look anything like we have now. They've become much more streamlined and now we have pressure canners, etc. But the mechanism of actually cooking food under pressure with steam was invented a long time ago. And it was actually Napoleon needed a way to get food to his troops, and they created a big contest. And that was how the pressure cooking was originally done. And then, of course, we've had lots of iterations since then. But to say that the pressure cooker is a rather new invention, not true at all. Now, when we look at the ways that we have preserved food throughout history, canning is very new in glass jars. Now, we had metal canning in tins, and they were actually soldered with lead. That's how they would seal them. It would take out the oxygen, of course, and we know, as we have seen throughout history, if you ate a large consumption of those, you could actually get lead poisoning, and there was issues with eating food only from tins, especially ships and shipwrecks where you had sailors and that was the only food that they could eat, ended up developing a lot of harmful things that happened from that. So the glass jar, what we all refer to, most of us, as a mason jar, was first invented in 1858. So that's actually when your mason jar was invented. And of course, something was invented in 1858. It took a while for that to become widespread. And then, of course, you had Ball that came in, and then lastly was Kerr. And Kerr actually was the company that invented the two-piece metal band and lid system that we have now. You had some of the older ones where you had rubber gaskets, you had glass lids, you had zinc lids. There was lots of different variations since the first invention of the mason jar in 1858. So really preserving your vegetables and meat and fruit in glass jars with canning, it's a relatively recent method of food preservation. And it was originally, when you look back, we have the formation of what we now call the USDA in the early 1900s. In fact, the first publication of canning with recipes was for canning peaches and was in a publication in 1910. That's only 112 years ago. So when you look back through history, that's actually not that long ago. So that's when you begin to have instructions for canning fruit using the water bath and or open kettle canning methods. Okay, 1910 was the first publication of that. It was in 1917, so only 7 years from there, that we came out with the guidelines and the recommendations that meat and vegetables, non-acidic foods, should be canned in a pressure canner. So those actually have been the guidelines for well over 100 years. Just a lot of people didn't know them, didn't learn them, and didn't practice them, and handed down practices that didn't use the pressure canner for many years. So it's actually been something that we've had, and these recommendations have been around for a really long time. Now, we had extensive study done where almost all of our now guidelines and times when it comes to canning come from, especially the pounds per pressure for different foods and how long you can them at pounds per pressure, etc. Obviously, the only way to achieve that is by using a pressure canner, was done in the 1940s and was actually done during World War II. And the reason for that is because the US government needed the populace to be putting up their own food because they needed to take the food that was being commercially canned in tins and a lot of the food supply, again, where war comes into play with this, and ship it to the troops in Europe for World War II. So they did a lot of studying at that time on how to safely can food because there was a lot of instances where the food would go bad. So it was being canned without following what we now consider our safety standards. And so you had people that were losing food. They were putting it up, but it was going bad. And you did have cases of botulism. So it was in the government's best interest, because they needed to get food to the troops, to figure out how to make sure that the food that was being canned at home was done so safely and was lasting people so that they could actually rely on it. So when you look at what was the motivation for those studies at that time and the funding for it, and how we have, even to this day, the majority of our canning information is based upon those studies from that time period. Now, the reason we haven't had much past then is because the government no longer was in their interest, right? They didn't need people to can food at home anymore after the war ended. And so there's not much money either in those studies to be made. And so a lot of the studies and things that we have now, of course, is if there's money behind it, people are willing to do studies and to invest in that. And there's just not a lot of that. There are some studies that we had done in the 1990s by some different extension offices and state universities, etc., that have slightly changed just a few things. It's no longer recommended to can summer squash all by itself in a pressure canner because of density issues, for example. But pretty much the majority of our safe and tested guidelines are based upon from what was done in the 1940s, but even prior to that, it was 1917 that the recommendations to use a steam pressure canner system was actually put out. Now, if you are interested in learning more about preserving food at home, I highly encourage you to grab a copy of my book, Everything Worth Preserving, because not only does it go through all of the canning, both pressure canning, fruits, vegetables, and meats, but all of the different ways of home food preservation, because as we just learned, canning is relatively new, but there's many ways that we have been preserving food safely at home for centuries, even thousands of years, that we can employ today, and I go over all of those in that book.